Hello, everyone. Well, welcome to Politics in the Pub. Thank you for everyone that's come out tonight. I know it's been a really busy agenda with a massive night last night for the Power of Balance at DYRSL, but still we're here so that everyone has a chance to ask questions and we can have those discussions about the local issues. But I want to start by paying my respects and acknowledging the traditional elders of the land on which we meet and acknowledging their incredible custodianship of this beautiful land and country, and the importance of that and the fact that it was never ceded. I was incredibly proud of our area during the referendum with a strong vote of support, and I want to reassure everyone that in Canberra so many Indigenous leaders have actually taken great comfort from knowing that our area strongly supported reconciliation and recognition. And it meant a lot to them in a very difficult time to know that our area understood that need for acknowledging and for that constitutional recognition to get to reconciliation. So thank you, everyone. Now it's going to be a fun night, pretty casual way of doing politics. I like this. This is much better. But to come and MC us tonight, we have the fantastic Liam from the Tawny Fromouth. Of course, we all love getting the Tawny in our letterbox. We know how good it is to get that piece of local news. And also, as a very special guest, I've got Dr. Sophie Scamps is joining us. I've put her on the spot to come down. It is her daughter's birthday tonight, so she's doing a quick pop in and then she's heading off to, help blow out some candles. But anyway, I'll throw it over to Liam because he's going to grill us and quiz us.
Well, good evening.
like an ice cream.
And we've got trivia starting soon here at Freshie Brewing Co. So I thought we'd better start with some trivia. Are you ready? If you were to draw a line directly from Chatswood City Centre, east, which Northern Beaches suburb would you hit? Manly, Freshie or DY?
So east.
From Chatswood.
East from Chatswood.
Direct.
DY, wouldn't you? It would be DY.
Oh. Manly, correct. Ding, ding, ding.
Could I say? Geography, definitely not my best suit.
This is for Sophie then. Junior Rugby League club North Curl have which medieval nickname? The Crusaders, the Dragons or the Knights?
Crusaders.
Unlucky. The Knights. So, and then the last one for you both. Starting in 1913 and stopping in the 1930s, a tram ran north from Manly and it finished at which Northern Beaches suburb?
Northern Beaches suburb?
Narrowband.
Yeah, Narrowband. And there, can I just say, there's a lot of people that wish that decision hadn't been made to stop it. Exactly. If only they had preserved that laneway for a train and a tram, we wouldn't have quite the disaster we have on Military Road on such a frequent basis.
Now, and you've got to go pretty soon, but would you like to say anything first about last night, or then I've got a hard-hitting question for you. But,
Well, no, last night was a lot of fun, and I think it was great for Zali and I to be able to answer lots of different questions, but also have that endorsement from a former Liberal Party leader about why having more community independence really strengthens our democracy. What do you reckon, Zali?
Yeah, look, it's always fascinating. John Hewson gave a lot of insights of his time, obviously, as Liberal Party leader, but also how he's observing the evolution of politics in Australia. And I think we really are maturing. And anyone who maybe caught even Malcolm Turnbull at the National Press Club this week, where he is really pointing out that actually competition is a good thing. And, look, he was being very coy about who he was going to vote for, but he did point out that a lot of his volunteers are now wearing Allegra T-shirts. So I think it's telling, though, that they can see, and I think they reflect the community's concerns around where the current federal coalition is at. They are not a Liberal Party; they are a Conservative Party. We've got to really call it for what it is, and that means they're not really being true to the values that so many in our community want to see, especially when it comes to the future, what kind of intergenerational debt we're leaving when it comes to the environment and climate, and also just letting business be business, right? I'm just astounded every day at every new policy that comes out is an interventionist policy to break up markets, to take away, to break up businesses and interfere with how businesses are operating. We have systems in place like the ACCC that maintains competition, and you need scrutiny and you need vigilance. But we shouldn't have government threatening to break up business and intervene and take over business.
No, perfect. Well, I did some research too. Back when the Tawny first started, and we had, no advertisers really, we did a big 5-page interview with Zali, and mainly featuring a lot of skiing and Queenwood photos. But you described yourself as a small L Liberal. Now, what does that mean still to you, and how does that apply being a small L Liberal in contemporary politics?
Well, like I was just saying, I don't recognise it at all in the current federal coalition. They are a conservative party. For me, it's about, I want to see competition. I want to see our communities supported to be safe, to ensure we have systems in place, right? We need the government to work in that sense, but we also need business and industry to have that opportunity to thrive. So I don't want to see IR laws that are putting undue burden and really stopping progress and innovation. I want to see small businesses more supported. So I don't want to see big government, but we want to see effective government. And I do take issue with some of the policies that we see coming out of the modern, the federal coalition, which is replacing, for example, even the call to get rid of the 40-odd thousand of public servants. It's only to replace them with more consultants, which come at a greater cost to the public purse. And having been the MP for Warringah during the COVID years and after that, and I saw firsthand the frustration for the community where you couldn't get a passport within any kind of decent time frame for love or money because there were not enough people working in there. You simply couldn't get an aged care plan or reviews of your NDIS because they just didn't have enough people in the system to process things. And so the very real consequence of not having enough people doing those frontline jobs is you as community members pay the price, can't access those services that are there to help you. So I think it's really important when we talk about fiscal discipline and making sure we are addressing our fiscal deficit when it comes to the budget, that we genuinely look at where we can find the money. And there's a lot of sectors that are not getting taxed appropriately, and I think of big fossil fuel companies when I'm saying that. But it's not about reducing the quality of service that the Australian peoples get from government departments.
And Sophie, a big question, the community independents have been so successful, and as a sort of result of that, one of the fear campaigns is often what's going to happen if there's a minority government. If you are successful, if independents are successful, what do we have to fear?
Absolutely nothing. You've got a lot to gain, I think. We make our democracy stronger. I think it's really important for people to know that there is the capacity for us as independents to retain that ability to vote on every single bill on its merits. That's really important for people to understand. There's always this, what deal are you going to do? What agreement are you going to meet? And I think people like Andrew Wilkie and others who were in that minority government with the Gillard government realise that actually the power lies in maintaining and retaining our strength as independents and continuing to assess every single bill on its merits and continuing to take the views and values of our communities to Canberra. And I think that's why people would be voting for us, and why would we throw that away? If we wanted to be part of a party, we probably would have joined one. We don't particularly want a party. We don't want to be told how to vote, and we certainly don't want a party line to toe.
This question is fascinating. We are getting daily requests from media around that question of who will we support and who would I support and how come I'm not saying ahead. And it just, confounds me that somehow by asking it again and again, you're going to get a different answer. But also, has no one ever gone into a mediation? And does everyone turn up at an auction and announce to the vendor what their top limit price is before they head into there? Like, it's kind of this weird process where they don't want to hear the answer, which is being true to our values, true to the issues we are taking to our community. If we are re-elected, then it is because the community trusts us to act on those issues consistently with our pledge. And so this idea that we would reveal all ahead of time, I have said in exchange, a starting point for me to know, I would like to see the Liberal National agreement before the election so that I can also know who will be dictating policy around what areas. I think the community has a right to know that piece of information as well.
Sophie, you've got to get to a 16th birthday party. So a healthcare question. I was lucky enough to study physiotherapy at Sydney Uni and did prac at Mona Vale. And now we have this Northern Beaches Hospital. It's just been banned to have public-private hospitals. What's going to happen with Northern Beaches Hospital?
That's the big question. And we have the one and only public-private hospital remaining in the state of New South Wales, and the Minns government has decided, and actually there was an inquiry that was handed down in 2020 into Northern Beaches Hospital, which recommended that there be no more public-private partnerships when it comes to delivering public health care. So we've got the remaining one. The big question is there's now an inquiry. We very, very tragically and sadly had some really high-profile deaths. That is horrific for our community, but they're only the tip of the iceberg. But the one thing we need to be mindful of is that the nurses, the health staff, the allied health staff, the pharmacists are all digging in, and they have been digging in for years now and doing everything they possibly can to deliver the highest quality healthcare, but it is the system that is stretching them to the limit. So we were going to be the only public hospital, privately operated, that would not have the minimum safe standards for nurse-to-patient ratios, and that is unacceptable. So I think there's general agreement in the community that we would like our hospital to go back to public hands so that the workers inside the hospital have a safe environment to work in, and that we have the highest quality healthcare as well. And I think that we'll keep pushing until we get that done.
Yeah, I mean, it's so important that healthcare... Unfortunately, we lost two good operating hospitals, Mona Vale Hospital and Manly Hospital. I was born in Manly Hospital. A lot of people actually in our community were. We lost two really good operating hospitals under the Berejiklian state government. And that's a decision that I think there is not yet really full accountability on the decision and the modelling and what the terms of the agreement were in handing over that opportunity to a private company to run the hospital. There are not enough mechanisms to ensure those nurse-to-patient ratios are adequate. There is an independent audit happening at the moment with a report expected in June. The difficulty will come back to funding. To have an additional public hospital will require additional funding from federal government to New South Wales for that to be divvied up, because we know New South Wales gets shortchanged on our GST revenue. So if re-elected, we will be in there fighting for increased revenue for New South Wales to ensure there is that capacity to make sure we have the health services that are adequate for our community. I mean, it has to be that minimum standard that we have a well-functioning emergency department and public hospital.
Thank you. Sophie's got to get to her 16th birthday. You better...
Thanks, everyone. I just wanted to pop in and say hi, but it's my daughter's 16th birthday party, so I'll leave you to it. And thanks very much for having me on for a guest appearance. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie. And I wanted to remind everyone, of course, with the redistribution, some areas of Warringah are now part of Mackellar, North Curl, DY, Forestville, Allambie Heights, Killarney Heights. A lot of areas have now moved over. They were independent, strong areas, and I hope they are well behind Sophie as well now. Thanks, Sophie.
Now, one last question from me and then open to the floor. Accountability. Something I haven't heard spoken about much is the horrific treatment of whistleblowers in the last few years. And it seems like the big boys are both in on this, and I don't really know how anyone would be brave enough to be a whistleblower going forward. So how do we fix this?
Yeah, and what's really frustrating is, like a couple of other issues, in opposition, Labor had indicated they would strengthen whistleblower protections, and they would in fact support legislation to make sure there was adequate protections. Unfortunately, like we've seen on a few other areas, they get into government and then they fail to deliver. What we've seen is that, yes, they've instituted the National Anti-Corruption Commission, but they did a deal with the coalition to make sure the threshold for corruption was so high that no one's ever found to have behaved in a conduct manner, and it's all behind closed doors, so the public doesn't get any visibility around that investigation. Now, whistleblowers was part of that suite of integrity and accountability measures. So along with National Anti-Corruption, you need to have a process for people to be able to raise the red flag, raise the alarm around conduct happening within departments without fearing prosecution and losing their jobs. And what we're seeing now with some very high-profile cases, that those that have raised awareness to wrongdoings, right, completely wrongdoings within the ATO, our defence, they are the ones facing prosecution, they're in jail and ruined for life at the moment defending that. The Attorney General could intervene, could have stopped the prosecutions over the last 3 years. He's failed to do that. And he's also failed to introduce legislation to make it create those protections that we need. For our democracy to work, you do need those accountability pieces. I don't dispute that we want to make sure it's never at the expense of our national security and defence and those kind of issues. But when public service or departments or wrongdoing is happening, we have to have a system that allows people to bring that to the attention to authorities so that can be investigated, and we then, the general public, for the public good, benefits from highlighting those inconsistencies. So it is really disappointing of the Labor government. Look, disappointing but not surprising. It happens on many fronts. Truth in political advertising is another one. Labor was really loud in opposition that they would support it, but at the end of the day, they did a deal with the coalition and they shelved it. So that's why I would argue we will all benefit from a parliament of balance and more crossbench influence, having that say and ultimately pushing the major parties to do these changes. Whistleblowers is very big on the list.
Now, thank you. Has anyone got some questions? I can bring the microphone to you, or...
Hi, thanks. Hi, Zali. Just wondering, are there any bills in the offing for relating to truth in political advertising?
Yes. Yes. Well, unfortunately, once the writs are issued, all the bills from the 47th Parliament that have been tabled lapse, and then it becomes the 48th Parliament where you have to reintroduce them. So since 2019, I have introduced Stop the Lies and voter protections to push the government of each time to introduce truth in political advertising. Don Farrell and the Albanese government did, in fact, in November last year, introduce two pieces of legislation. They introduced a piece of one that was called the Electoral Donation Reform Bill, and one was the Electoral Communication Reform Bill. Now, but one was to address donations and money in politics, and the other was to address truth in political advertising. Now, unfortunately, one bill was actually well drafted. The Communications Bill was pretty good, very consistent with the ones that I had proposed, and had the support of the crossbench and could have passed. We could have passed that before Christmas last year. But instead, what Don Farrell, the minister, did is he wanted to say he had tried, he had tabled it, and then in the deal they did with the coalition, they shelved it. So it stayed on the notice paper. I moved motions to get them to debate it and vote it, because the crossbench were prepared to vote for it, and so that could have become law. But a deal, again, the two major parties, imagine Coles and Woolies getting together, writing the rules around competition, and at the same time dipping into the public purse for who's going to pay what per votes. They did a deal to shelve truth in political advertising. So the outcome, we have political parties have rigged the game for 2028, where they will have a national cap of 90 million to spend around the country, while independents have a cap on a per seat basis. There's discrepancies when it comes to donation caps and all sorts of other loopholes that allow the political parties to get more money, and third party organisations to also participate with less caps. Meanwhile, a 47% increase to how much the public will pay per vote to politicians. So I always challenge anyone to think of what other areas getting a 47% increase. Not too many around there. And in the meantime, they keep the privilege to lie to you. So it's one of those areas, I know I've said this a lot. When I got into politics in 2019, coming as a barrister, I've been in commercial litigations, I've acted in consumer law where you apply, consumers are protected from misleading and deceptive advertising. We respect our money. We don't want to be scammed from our money through advertising that is false. But yet, when it comes to our most important decision, our vote, we are absolutely open to being scammed because there is no voter protections when it comes to that advertising. So I think it's a really important thing that needs to happen to protect our democracy. What happens when you haven't got truth in political advertising is you have you have a lot of false facts and false narratives that take hold. You have a real challenge of the truth and the facts, and you have a challenge then to outcomes of elections. And we saw that at its worst in the US in the January 6th insurrection. So really important, I think, to maintain factual debates and truth in political advertising. Yep.
Hi, Zali. I was just wondering, since the state government has put a ban on public and private hospitals amalgamation, do you think you and Sophie could actually combine powers and actually take that contract away from HealthScope and get that back into public hands as probably in the next 2 to 3 years?
Well, look, what was good from the Minns government is they've come out saying there can be no further public-private models from here on in. So that's at least good news. Unfortunately, that doesn't fix the problem of Northern Beaches Hospital. And as I said, the way the funding is divvied up by number of hospitals we have in New South Wales. So you can't just... So the ideal scenario is to turn Northern Beaches Hospital back to being a genuinely fully public hospital. The problem will be the funding and how that can happen from a contractual point of view. So that's going to be, that's why the Auditor General review will be really important. Because we are hoping it will set out the regulatory pathway for that to be achieved. But there's no doubt that the current model isn't working. I've had many meetings with the nurses because they are being pressed so hard in terms of meeting, the desire to care for the community, the expectations, in a work environment that does not fairly will provide the safest environment where they have sufficient resources and nurses and nurse-to-patient ratios. So it's a complex problem, but it's one we need to fix. Unfortunately, when you privatise, sometimes essential services, that becomes a real issue. We've seen that with our transport as well, with the buses. As soon as you privatise, you lose the lever to really fix and scale up what's needed to serve the community. Now, Liam, you can put in the question.
Yeah. Well, on behalf of Freshwater Brewing Co, Buckety's, Dad and Dave's, can we get rid of the beer excise completely?
We laugh, but I have met with a lot of the brewers and I know there's a real discrepancy. It's actually also the distilleries. So when the alcohol excise is really unfairly applied between gin and the spirits and beer compared to wine. And this is purely political because some time ago... I don't know, but I think it's about 20 or 30 years ago. I'm not quite sure of the date. Essentially, there was a really big push for our wine industry to do well in export and to develop as an industry. And so they were given I wouldn't say a free pass, but an easier pass to ensure that the costs stayed down with much lower excise. And unfortunately for brewers and for our area where we have such a vibrant community here in Brookvale, it's something we really want to see. They have agreed to freeze it, so that has been, in the recent budget, there was a freezing of the excise, so at least it's not continually to grow. But yes, it still needs to be addressed.
So, I have a question about the AUKUS deal with submarines that I... oh, sorry, getting too high. I understand... reason the microphone works sometimes, but...
Is it AUKUS playing with the microphone?
I keep pressing and then depressing. I thought I need to keep my finger on. Sorry, Tim. Tim will tell me what to do stuff. But yeah, we are now in a situation where Australia is going to spend 300 billion plus on something that in Ukraine kind of been proven that a $100,000 drone can do the same. Or maybe not, but it will take 20 years before we get them. Is this something Australia should still focus on?
Well, we are an island continent. We are a small population compared to the size of our landmass. We do not have capacity on our own to defend Australia. So I think we have to be really clear about being realistic, that we have to have strong allies, and we will need the assistance of our allies from a defence point of view. We will always need submarines as an island nation. So submarines are an essential part of our defence capabilities. And AUKUS is not the introduction of something completely new. It is, and I know there's a lot of concern around it being nuclear-propelled submarines, but ultimately it is a way of looking at it. It is a progression in the types of submarines that we are purchasing to protect Australia. So in the sense of having a submarine program, it is not a new concept. We've had one and we need one. In fact, the concern is our Collins class will have to be retired. They're going to be extended as much as possible, but retired by 2038. Which means, from the briefings I've received, we do need to have assurance of replacements being built or in process by 2028. So if you think about it, we're in 2025. 2028 is the end of this next term of Parliament. By then, we need to have assurance that there are submarines in the pipeline to be delivered to Australia by that time that we need them. So the problem is it's not like you can go to the supermarket and find other submarines quite that easily. And unfortunately, the government has had a tendency to burn its international relationships over submarine contracts. I'm not sure the French will be really welcoming us with open arms. So my focus around AUKUS is what assurances is the government obtaining from the US that we will get value for money and we will get submarines for the huge amount of money that we are paying. Meanwhile, what plan B are we developing in the event we are not delivered with an assurance by 2028 that those submarines will become available when we need them? And what other work are we doing around our capacity? So, as you say, drones have been shown to be incredibly effective in Ukraine, and I met with the Ukrainian ambassador and discussed that. And I will be raising, looking at a bilateral agreement with Ukraine around helping us develop more drone technology. We actually have companies here in Brookvale, actually Drone Shield and other that are big in the defence industry. So drones will play a huge part for a continent like Australia, where we have huge coastline, to observe, and obviously very hard to do it in manned sort of craft. We also don't have much eyes in the sky. We don't have satellites. So we rely on other nations for our satellites, information and data. And that's really important for defence, but it's actually also very important for climate risk. We don't have our own satellites measuring and keeping track of changes. So that's, again, a great exposure. With the Superpower Institute, we had a proposal to Chris Bowen and the government over the last 2 budgets around getting funding for satellites for better measurement and monitoring of methane and coastal activities and to help monitor the Australian coastline. Unfortunately, the government still hasn't really stepped up to the plate to fund that, but it is something we need to be conscious of. We can't just rely on other nations' satellites. We need our own capacity. The Morrison government had a space plan, and unfortunately the Albanese government dissolved that space agency and pretty much defunded everything. And I was quite critical of that because we do need to maintain some domestic capacity. So to get back to the submarines, one of the briefings I got around that was very similar to a Utopia episode. If anyone's watched a Utopia episode around why we might need submarine capacity to defend ourselves from our biggest trading partner, to defend our trading ships, it was very similar. I swear the writers of Utopia must have been in the room. But we do have to be mindful. We've managed to resume trading relationships with China, but that's taken a lot of diplomacy. Obviously, we're expecting tariffs now to be imposed by the US. So I think defence and trade, we need to have a very nuanced, mature approach to our relationships with the big powers, be it the US, be it China. And then I think we do need to look back to the EU and the UK so that we have options and we're not, I think, wedged between 2 major superpowers, between trading and defence.
Well said. Yeah.
Hi, Zali. Late last year, you did a forum on housing at Mackellar RSL, and then we did some feedback after that. In this election campaign, my observation is that the major parties' suggestions on the housing issue are fairly piecemeal. They're just sort of a help to buy scheme or something about migration on the part of the Liberals. But I just wonder, have you sort of changed your thinking about the housing issues, or what the community independents is saying about how we're really going to address it? Because, you know, and it's an area around here, it's very hard for...
It's very hard, and we have to... No one problem happens without being part of a puzzle of other issues. You can't have... so housing, the problem is supply and affordability. So supply can't really can be fixed by a couple of ways. Supply can be fixed by more building, more medium to high density in our areas, or more building and expanding the Sydney region. It can also be done by better utilisation of current supply. So we have a high proportion of empty bedrooms and empty, and I'd say poorly occupied properties where no offence to retirees, but where, you know, people are in large family homes with a lot of empty bedrooms. There is nothing in our system that incentivises people to downsize and free up equity in the family home and free up those spaces. So I think there has to be a discussion of that transition of stamp duty so that there is an incentive for people to downsize. There should also be incentives around renting out of rooms or utilisation of rooms for current family homes without impacting the capital gains exemption of the family home, because it then becomes income earning. Same with granny flats. So at the moment we pretty much have at every point there is a disincentive to better utilise current housing supply. From a tax point of view, you'll be penalised for trying to better utilise it. So they're things federal government can look at, levers to try and free up supply straight away, without it always come at a cost, because at the moment there's just no incentive. Now, the building of more density is complex because as we all know on the beaches, our transport is challenging. We only have 2 main roads in and out. We have no trains. We have ferries. And we have buses, and our buses are pretty unreliable at the moment. So higher density comes at a price when it comes to transport and congestion. We can't have more density without fixing congestion as well. Congestion, so we had Beaches Link Tunnel. If it was done right, I've very much supported it. The problem is both sides have shelved it on the basis that it was too expensive and too difficult. My meetings with them have been around what's Plan B. How viable is Spit Bridge? This is an old infrastructure. Is it going to break down on us, and are we going to have a drawbridge? How trustworthy is it? And also, what are our alternatives? So alternatives are making better use of the current metro that... Come on through. The better use of the metro to Chatswood, for example, by utilising the east-west link from DY to Chatswood and getting, for example, a transit lane or a bus lane going that way. They are looking at it. They are analysing the bus network and seeing what are the pinch points. When we looked at housing, so we have to do transport with housing. If not, we just create more congestion and more problem. The other issue we have to look is affordability for housing, and so that means that opportunity to get in. So both major parties, you have the help to buy scheme, which I supported. It's not enough. The last budget improved the price point at which it's available, which means it may become more available in our area, and what the maximum income threshold was for people to be able to benefit from it. The Coalition are suggesting again for people to dip into their super to pay for that. I don't support that. That's just creating a problem for the future. And we already have an affordability problem in the future with an ageing population. So I think it's really important not to be dipping into super. We do need to look at the taxation benefits that are around investment property. I am very willing to look at, and I've asked PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Office, to cost for me what would a cascading scheme look like. So, for example, you make no changes to the family homes exemption from capital gains. You make no changes to the first investment property that has the benefit of a 50% deduction from capital gains. But, for example, if the second investment property was only a 25% benefit of exemption of capital gains and none from third property onwards. So what benefit do we start to build into the system by getting that to happen? Now, for that to happen, though, you need political courage. The major parties not so keen on introducing this, but we have to have this difficult conversation. So I am for, we can't pull the rug out from underneath people. People have relied on investment properties as a investment strategy for 40 years. You can't turn around and just change that overnight, but we have to create a process of generational equity for young people to be able to get into buying or at least affording to rent a home. So we have to put all these things on the table. And like any good mediation, I think every sector of the community is going to have to give a bit. But I think for the overall benefit of having a community where young people can afford to stay, where we can have teachers and ambulance and police and we can have essential services living in our community, it's a really important discussion to have. Say, Liam, do many people write in about this to the Tawny Fromouth?
I think housing's the biggest issue, to be honest, and having something in place with these new mid to low rise where 20% is set aside for nurses, teachers, aged care workers seems to be a really big one because they all drive in from Central Coast but then I don't think Min's had anything in that plan setting that up, so I'd say it's the biggest issue.
I strongly support a 10% mandatory zoning component for essential services. The difficulty will be how do you define that? Because, for example, we have a massive shortage of bus drivers. The Minns government has agreed to commission more buses for Keller's Downer for our route, but they cannot find bus drivers. So I'm writing to and pressing the federal government to create a permanent visa pathway for bus drivers so that they can actually bring people in that can become bus drivers. Because if we can't, no point in getting buses if no one's driving them. And no one can get to work if we don't have public transport. So it's one of those, I find it quite stunning that we have to think of it from an immigration point of view to get people in to be bus drivers. But we need all those essential services. So that mandatory zoning is important, but the question's going to be, how do you define those essential services? Because the list becomes really long.
Hello, Leah here and Amelia from Zali. So obviously a question about young people and great segue with the housing discussion, but our question is a bit more broad. Looking at our friends, we know political engagement is a bit of an issue, so we really want to understand how can we make politics a bit more engaging. It's a difficult topic, but I mean, looking around the room, it's not to be rude, but it is important. And we make up a huge portion of the electorate, and it's going to be a really, really important vote to win. So how can we engage that? Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for being here, because it is really important to have young voices here. It's a conundrum that young people often don't feel represented by government, but then don't engage with the process, and yet their vote and their voice really matters. So I do welcome your input. The key is, I think, making politics accessible as well. I had a really interesting conversation during the federal budget last week in Parliament. So the government brought down, I don't know if they brought them down, but anyway, some influencers and online sort of social media personalities with big followings, a big reach to young people, came down, got the opportunity to see the budget and interview the Prime Minister and a few other people. And what was really fascinating was legacy media really had their nose out of joint about it. Like, they were really upset. There was allegations of had there been payment by the Prime Minister to bring them down there, and that was refuted. They openly said no, that, I spoke with Hannah Ferguson, she said no, they had paid their own way down. And there was this idea that we shouldn't make politics more accessible to young people through the very form and medium by which they get their news and information. So I thought that was a really interesting aspect in maybe why so many young people do disconnect and don't get engaged in politics. It's not seen as something that's welcoming them, and yet we absolutely need to change it. So policies like housing, like rental affordability, are really vital when it comes to young people. HECS, being able to bring down that debt and make it a fairer system around how the debt is calculated over time is really, but I think we need to have an intergenerational paper in the budget. So at the moment, the budget papers come out and you get a women's economic statement paper. I think we should have a generational economic impact paper in the budget so that you can really analyse across the various spends how they translate to benefit for different segments of the community. Because what we know currently, we have 4 people working for 2 people not working and retired. By 2040, that's going to reverse. So there'll be 2 people working for 4 people retired. Now that's going to put a huge stress on our systems. How are you going to pay for aged care? And I can see your face. You're just thinking, that's just not going to be good. It's not. So our model is not sustainable. We have to have those tough conversations to look at how are we going to transition to a different revenue model and a fairer model from a generational equity.
Hey, Zara, this one's probably a build on the engagement question, actually, because clearly by the turnout tonight, you can see there's a lot of engagement by the people here, and they appreciate the value that a community-independent movement can bring to politics around the country. I know I've had a few instances recently where I'm having conversations with people who aren't necessarily in this electorate. And I think, so what I was thinking was, maybe you have 3 quick points you might be able to share with the group here about how they can to talk about the value of an independent candidate in their local area.
Sure, thank you. Well, I guess I'd also say of getting involved is important. Tim Walz in the US election had a great quote, and he said, you might not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. Because politics is in every aspect of your life, makes laws that dictates your life, your opportunities, how much tax you pay, where you can go, everything. So it's really important to be engaged. And for too long, politics has been about a vote every 3 years. Don't you worry about anything else in between. We've got this. Parliament is a bubble. We'll pull back. We'll close the curtains. Don't worry too much about what happens, and we'll come back to you in 3 years' time when you want your vote. For me, it's been about pulling back the curtain to make sure the community is represented, but also there's that ability to participate. We've got to burst the bubble of Canberra. Canberra has to be accountable to the rest of the country, has to apply the same standards. So I think in the conversations for people is generally, do you just vote by party lines? Why? Do you think that's working for you? Because if you continually are unhappy about outcomes or decisions, it's maybe worth checking, are you continuing to do the same thing but hoping for a different outcome? It's not going to happen, unfortunately. The career politicians will still do it the same way. And so it's apply the same principles you would in your normal life or in business. If you want competition when you go in supermarkets or cars or phones or everything else you do, then competition in Parliament is really good as well for outcomes. So looking at what choice you have at within your community, ballot paper, do a bit of research, go and check out people's position on policy, voting records for incumbents. I think that's really important. A lot of incumbents from major parties will make a lot of promises at election time, but they're completely inconsistent with how they've voted for the last 3-6 years that they've been in Parliament. So, and I actually had a conversation with the ABC for their vote compass on this, that I challenged them that it's not good enough to calculate vote compass on the basis of the policy promise that is being made by a party at election time. It should also put into the model how they have voted on that issue over the last term of Parliament, because the promise at election time is really just gaslighting if it's not consistent with voting. So it'll be interesting to see if everyone goes and does vote compass, what you think of where the ABC landed for that. But I think have those conversations. Politics is one of those things, the more you talk about it, the more you change it.
My question is, why is modern politics so ineffective? Just to take one example, gambling reform. A couple of years ago, the late Peter Murphy's review was so clear-cut. It seemed to have bipartisan support. Everyone was for it. It was a big issue. Here we are, whatever it is, 3-4 years later, crickets, pretty much nothing has happened. Why is it seemingly so easy for lobbyists to ride over public interest? And how do you tackle that when the grey men with the anonymous lanyards knock on your door in Canberra?
Yeah, look, at the lobbyists and those vested interest influence is really problematic. So banning gambling advertising is an absolute must be done. The committee that reviewed it, the harm that is being done is horrendous. Well, if I could just, for anyone who doesn't realise, we lose $27 billion a year to gambling offshore, right? So a huge amount. It adds a huge amount to our cost of our health service, mental health, addictions, domestic violence, unemployment. It has a huge social impact on our society. Gambling advertising is there. It catches teenagers before they're even legally allowed to gamble. It gamifies. You cannot watch sport without gambling advertising. Young people now understand the odds of the gamble more than they do the sport itself. It absolutely has to go. And if you think back to maybe 20, 30 years ago, you used to have maybe the TAB, the horses, maybe the dogs, but you didn't have this whole online apps on your phone, just how pervasive it now is, and the advertising is relentless. And the inquiry heard evidence from victims who were trying to rehabilitate, who basically were trying to stay clean, and then would see this repeated advertising, just barrage of it, and could not get away from their addiction. It's horrendous that we're not doing it. We've quizzed, so why hasn't it changed? Well, the Minister for Communications, Michelle Rowlands, her birthday party was hosted by the Hotel Association, right? And she takes donations from gambling companies. So to think that she would then crack down on gambling advertising, and we had them on the ropes. We had the Prime Minister and the Minister absolutely on the ropes that they needed to ban the gambling advertising. And then at the very last minute, they decided to shelve that, and under pretext of really caring about our young people's mental health online, introduce the age restriction for accessing social media to people under 16. And somehow that was going to replace the need for the gambling advertising ban. It hasn't gone away. We are locked and loaded on that. It is going to happen. The Prime Minister has been incredibly negligent in failing to implement at the minimum a scale back of gambling advertising, and it's because of the lobbying and the pressure he got from, it's not just gambling ad companies, it's also from free-to-air media, because they like the revenue from the advertising, but it is just not so significant that it warrants the harm we then get to society from that.
I could find other bird voice in it. So how the message the chamber how is to not to thank you spoke right but I haven't told me so interested now on how you can give it.
Because they have deep pockets. If you go and look at the registry of donations, the major parties receive a huge amount of donations from vested interest companies, from fossil fuels to hotel association, alcohol often, and gambling. And so they have power in that way. You only have to look at some of the campaigns independents are facing at the moment. It was in the media recently that a whole number of industries that do a lot of social harm are very worried about a Parliament of balance where crossbench might actually push them to do something about these harmful industries. And so they are putting a lot of money behind campaigns to discredit independence. We have at the moment a campaign called Australians for Prosperity, which is fully funded by fossil fuels, by coal lobby, Liberal MP that lost his seat, and they are running billboards and campaigns in independent seats, misrepresenting voting records and facts, to discredit independence, to give better prospects to major party MPs for getting up. It is that transparent, and the attacks are relentless, and that's why independence simply cannot get there without the community. If you as a community care about these issues, then you have to be engaged, because the only way you will send the message loud and clear to major parties that you're not okay with these issues and that lobbyists should not have more power over their decisions than voters is how you number your ballot box.
And was it, it could be a new bill, maybe. Was it Pocock who are these bloody people going in to Parliament House and also having like Albo's diary as a public asset that's live? Can that be somehow introduced? I'm sure they'd rig it, but... Real disclosure of ministers' diaries, I think, is important, and understanding that nexus between when there might be a dinner or a donation and then a decision from a minister involved, I think is really important. So that transparency is important. The passes in Parliament. As an MP, I have signed for people's passes because there are genuinely charities and groups that need access in Parliament, that ability to get there. It's an important part, but we should have a much more clear register around it, and we should have that transparency around who has passes, who we've, and how, especially that ability to get into Minister's office. There are thousands of people walking around Parliament on any given sitting day.
And they do just waltz in. My staff can tell you, our door, they will come into our suite, they will present stuff. Now, it is important for people to access, democracy and parliamentarians need to be accessible. So I don't have an issue with people being able to have passes. I want non-for-profit organisations, charities, conservation groups, business groups. I want them to be able to come in and see me and come to Parliament. It's important for our democracy, for business, for that to happen. But there does need to be transparency and accountability on who is signing who in and where are they going, who are they getting to speak to. And David has a private member's bill on that.
Now, it could be they're going to start trivia soon, so this might be the last one. 2 more. Go.
Hi, Zali. First of all, I am an absolute believer in your vision and values. As we are probably heading towards most likely a hung parliament, perhaps not, and you mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation that you're not prepared to play your cards to either of the major party, which of course makes sense. However, we do need to form government, we need to guarantee supply. And to do that, somebody such as yourself will be asked to guarantee supply on one side or the other. So as our constituents who are potentially going to be voting for you, I know you don't want to play your cards to the major parties, but can you tell us, would you guarantee supply to one side or the other? And if so, which side would that be?
Again, so what I can tell you is my process. I can't tell you the outcome because I don't know all the facts at this point. So I don't have visibility on what the outcome from the election will be. For example, we have minority government in the Senate. If it's a coalition government, so when the Morrison government, they had to negotiate for legislation with One Nation and the crossbench. The Albanese government in the Senate has to negotiate with the Greens and the crossbench. So there's already always been minority in the Senate. We're talking about whether or not that happens in the House as well. For me, a starting point from a process will be I will be true to the issues that I've taken to the Australian people, to Warringah. So I can't turn around and say I'm going to be a climate champion and advocate for us to progress transition and turn around and support legislation that winds it back, right? So I will be true to the issues that I have campaigned on and that I am hopefully re-elected on. That being said, for a side to form government, they need supply and confidence. So it's the money bills. It does not mean that legislation can't be tabled and presented from anywhere in the parliament. And changes to standing orders, I think, will be one of the first things that would happen from a minority government to ensure that there is a fairer process in the parliament. So in terms of the supply and confidence, a number one priority for me will be stability of government. Right? I don't want the Australian people's time and money to be wasted by having volatility or uncertainty. So the outcome will matter, the numbers will matter. Who is in a position to form a stable government when it comes to that supply and confidence? Is it a side that only needs 1 or 2 and they have 1 or 2 locked in by agreement? Is it a side that needs a lot more? There's just so many variables. I think a side that has a lot more MPs than the other has a prima facie, I think, opportunity to form government. But at the same time, it also then comes back to I will look at each piece of legislation on its merits. So even whoever forms government, that does not guarantee other bills getting through without scrutiny. I do not intend to form any deal. I don't want to be transactional about it. I don't think that is good politics, and that doesn't sit with me from an integrity point of view. And I've heard someone like Bob Katter say, open up the checkbook and, buy me a dam. Well, good luck relying on someone like Bob Katter. He only turns up 30% of the time to vote. So if he's who you're counting on to get there, your legislation probably won't get past half the time. So again, I can only be upfront in terms of the process I will follow in making that decision. My number one consideration will be stability of government and then supporting legislation that is consistent with the platform that I have taken to the Warringah people.
Last one.
Thank you, Zali. If I can just ask you a personal question. Everyone asks you questions about politics and what's your view on this and that, etc.
I'll work it out, come on.
Strung out all the time. But when you came into politics 6 years ago and you look... Okay, 9 years of your life. Is it what you expected? How do you find life in Canberra, travelling up and down? We've got to acknowledge your husband, Tim, who looks after the household. But I wonder, just on a personal level, how you find it.
Thank you. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of work, right? Everyone likes dumping on politicians and saying, you know, I reckon most in the public would be happy if politicians had to hitchhike their way to Canberra and sleep in a tent in front of Parliament House, right? It is 24/7 and the work, there's a lot of work. It's a lot of fun. I actually compare it often in my mind to back in my skiing days when I was a World Cup skier, and you would go away to an event and it would be a high intensity event where you had to perform in the moment. You'd spend a lot of time preparing for it and then you had to perform. You had an opportunity. And I feel often like the weeks in Canberra are very much like going to a World Cup where you've got to prepare for that week. You've got to line up what you're hoping to achieve. Circumstances will arrive and things will happen and you have to meet the moment when you're there and do your best in the moment, and then you come back and you keep training and doing the work back in the electorate. So ironically, it's a lot of fun, it's exhilarating, and sometimes you find yourself in the right place at the right time to really make a difference or to really hold people to account and to genuinely help people on the ground. And as a barrister for 10 years, I saw firsthand what badly drafted legislation does. So if you have poor legislation, people spend a lot of time on lawyers having to fight out what the meaning of a word or a provision might be in court. If you can just do the job well back in Parliament, when we pass the laws, we will save a lot of time, money and effort down the road. So for me, that's a priority, that opportunity to, as a barrister, I could help one client at a time. I feel like as a Member of Parliament, I can help a lot more people at a time by making sure the laws are as robust and as fair and as good as possible. Thank you.
Better pave the way for trivia. Thanks, Zali. Good luck. Any final... So you're going to go with Labor or Liberal? What was the... No.
Well, on that question, the other thing that's interesting that's always raised is it's raised like it's a presidential election, right, between Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton. At the end of the day, government is formed by a lot of people and you have to look at the capabilities of the front bench. Who is going to be Treasurer? Who would be Health Minister, Education Minister? I will look at the cohesive team as well, not just the leadership. So people focus on the idea of kingmaker or queenmaker, but it's actually, I want to see stable, good government, not just, you know, a presidential approach to who should get the privilege of being Prime Minister. But should I just say thank you so much for coming. I know it's been busy. We had a big event yesterday. To my team for organising, there's a lot on. We have another event next week. We have another Politics in the Pub up at the Oaks at Neutral Bay, if anyone couldn't make it tonight. Obviously, because Warringah has changed a lot, taking on new areas. With the seat of North Sydney being abolished, we now go all the way to Waverton, Wollstonecraft, Crow's Nest, North Sydney, Neutral Bay, Cremorne, so big other areas. So trying to make sure I do events in both sides so that we can hear from the community. But thank you so much. Thank you to the brewery for hosting us, and I hope there's a few people doing some trivia. Thank you. And thank you to Liam.